This is the critical minerals panel, and you'll see on your tables that you have some handouts. We're pulling it up on the screen right now, just talking about the importance of critical minerals when it comes to global supply chain, national security, and today I am honored to have two distinguished guests with me. Peter O'Rourke, former Acting Secretary of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and also a U.S. Navy and Air Force veteran, strategic advisor and current president of the National Association for Veteran Rights, and another, retired Major General Al Rosende. Al, you are the CEO of M2i. Extensive background, both of you, military logistics, defense. So I'd like to start, as we hear on the critical minerals panel, about geopolitical risks. Peter, you've worked in government and understand the complexity of supply chains, experienced that at the VA, of course. How would you say the U.S. Reliance on countries like China for critical minerals impacts our national security, and really what are the biggest vulnerabilities you would say we face right now?
Thanks, Ashleigh. And for those that are wondering what the Department of Veterans Affairs and being in the military has to do with critical minerals or supply chains, they actually have quite a bit to do when you think about it from the perspective of how decisions are made, and especially the U.S. federal government, but I think in most governments when it comes, especially to issues that are highly technical and complex. Fortunately for me, I had the experience to do a lot of supply chain work and a lot of origination work when it comes to where some of our critical parts came from. So a lot of that was tracing it all the way back to its critical parts, its critical minerals, those kind of things. But then the experience being at probably the high end of the federal level, I can tell you, and what's interesting and probably would go along with what's the biggest challenge, is the lack of knowledge. And I think there's probably nobody in this room that doesn't understand that. Intimately, it was just said in the previous panel, we need to find capital. Where is that going to come from? We need to have a strategic view. That struck me because having these conversations, whether it's the Department of Defense, with the Defense Logistics Agency, whether that's with elected officials that are on Ways and Means that control a lot of our critical minerals policy from a legislative standpoint, there's a lot that we don't know when it comes to the technical challenges, whether that's in the financing of these projects, or whether it's in just how to find them, what the discovery of those things mean. So there's a gap, and it's a gap when you think of the policy formation and how accurate those discussions and then the subsequent policy can then equate to. We see this in multinational groups like the Quad. We see this in just internally in the U.S. federal government. We can see it a lot with our relationships, whether it's USMCA between Mexico and Canada, these conversations on what we should do. Everybody has their own opinion. But I think that's, from my perspective, obviously it's not from the technical perspective of whether it's junior miners or larger miners, but from a formulation of political policy, it's really that lack of really getting into the details and knowledge and understanding of what you're dealing with.
Thank you for that, Peter. And I would ask you, Al, from a defense and military perspective, how would disruptions in supply of critical minerals like rare earth elements, affect military operations?
Well, sure. Thank you. First of all, I just want to state as a disclaimer, if the attorneys are in the room, I'm speaking based on my own experience and what I see. I'm not speaking on behalf of DOD or the Army or any federal government agency. So, but at the end of the day, when you have a supply chain disruption, which was the question, right? You deter or you impact the ability to drive on with current operations, training, and ensuring that your readiness at the highest levels. So anything from an operational capability can be disrupted because it requires maintenance, it requires upkeep, it requires modernization. And we all know that we used to see three domains, right? Air, land, and sea. And even just in those three domains, we rely on what we call the ISR assets, which are intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. And most of those assets rely on other pieces of equipment rather than just a service member on the ground. So we require satellites, we require those kinds of communications, we require those kinds of sensors, and all of those are based on critical materials and minerals. And as they either get used up or they require maintenance, critical materials provides the raw material that allows you to have the supply chain ready to go so that you can maintain those equipments at the highest level of readiness. And so it really impacts our operational capabilities on the ground. And the capability is the combination of the service member that's trained and ready to go, that's equipped appropriately with the most modern technologies, which is what makes us the #1 military in the world. Without that technology combined with the highest level of readiness of our service members, we're not capable. We can't really do what we need to do.
Excellent point. And to dovetail on that, I'd like to continue and just ask you, about certain critical minerals. Let's talk about, say, tungsten, beryllium, aluminum, their importance.
Sure, absolutely. And as you look at the modern technology that's infused in all of the equipment that we're using now, whether it's drones, whether it's the most advanced fighters that you have in the Air Force or in the Navy, you rely on a lot of alloys and very light materials. So when you're looking at light materials, you're looking at, and strong materials, you're looking at aluminum, you're looking at antimony just for our weapon systems to make sure that our missiles and ammunition is as strong as possible and will achieve the objective of being able to disrupt what we're trying to disrupt when we use our munitions. So all of those key materials become very, very important. Beryllium, which has a very weight ratio that it has, allows you to infuse it and utilize it in alloys to make them stronger and lighter, and as well as the heat properties of it allow it to diffuse that heat and allows those materials to survive in active combat.
And I would add too is, as a fighting force that relies a lot on technology, one of the unfortunate things where we came from is there was a lot more just blunt force trauma types of things. But now with the advanced technologies, whether it's missiles or all these things, I think all of them use a myriad of these critical minerals. Most of the operators and even probably the technologists that are thinking about the development of what those requirements ought to be don't always consider maybe the difficulty of how to get those. So that means on our industrial base, who just wants to give and sell as much as they can, so we still have those disconnects when it comes to these specific issues.
Absolutely. And Peter, I would ask you, what steps the U.S. government, from your background, strategy, policy, what would you say steps the U.S. government can take to really safeguard critical mineral supplies for national defense? And do you think we're doing enough?
We could do something. Let's be too light about it. No, I mean, this has been a long-term thing, especially from a policy perspective. It's not something that's unknown. It's not something that our services haven't been raising to the attention of whether it's legislators or different administrations. I mean, the critical minerals list is a product that's come out for decades. It's got some more, it's had some more substantive work done in the past decade, starting in the Obama administration, leading into the Trump administration with an updated and refreshed list. Same kind of, I won't say the same momentum, but the same momentum in the Biden administration with at least the recognition and maintaining those. I think the point that's interesting, and I don't really know where it divides, right? Because critical minerals are just as critical depending on what technologies they're going to go into, whether it's defense tech, whether it's clean tech, it's all the same stuff. You tell me what your priority is, that's where we're going to put the money. So in one aspect, we're still pushing out a certain amount of federal funding to do some sort of development, maybe not always put in the right places, whether it's processing, whether it's discovery, those kind of things, but there's some recognition of it. Again, there's a gap in really understanding how to strategically manage those issues. And again, I love the comment about capital. It's like where to actually route capital to where it can make the most difference. And I think how to make the most difference, or what is the best difference to make, it's a big question.
Absolutely.
So global supply chain, I would say, and economic leverage here. It's hard to believe that China dominates in so many areas, 80%. Maybe it's not so hard to believe. So I would ask you, how do you think that dominance in the critical mineral space really gives them economic leverage over the U.S. and its allies?
They have the biggest bank. I mean, if you look at commodities, the way at least the way I look at it very simplistically is, and when you do the research and you go back to the early 80s and you see where we we being probably North America gave up the discovery, processing, and basically consumption in a lot of ways of these materials. We gave away the bank, and recreating that bank, just like recreating, we've gone through this period in the Defense Department where we had to recreate capability. It's incredibly hard to do.
It takes an awful long time to recreate capability, right? And when you look at the mining industry in the United States, we began offshoring stuff way back at the beginning of the 20th century, if not even before. As a result of that, in 1939, the National Defense Stockpile Act went into place to try to stockpile material that would be supporting the Department of Defense. And it started with just $10 million back in 1939. And then over the years, that stockpile grew and grew as the requirements grew, World War II, Cold War, and so forth. At the end of the Cold War, though, when we got the peace dividend at the end of the 80s, early 90s, they began to sell off the material because we believed we didn't require it anymore. At the end of the day, though, the current National Defense stockpile is way too small to even support the Department of Defense. That's one way that you can get around a global supply chain or a disruption in the global supply chain is having a stockpile. Stockpile is ineffective at this point, and it only supports the national emergency. So you're really talking about, the Department of Defense in a combat environment when you require it. So we need something that's a lot broader that allows us to also support the economic security. So we need to look at different ways of being able to ensure that global supply chain continues to exist.
Which leads me right to my next question. We're here talking about why it's so critical to invest in these minerals, in these metals. We talked about the risks, so let's talk about solutions. And I would ask you, Peter, really what strategies should the U.S. pursue, would you say, to reduce the dependency on foreign sources for critical minerals? And how do we really diversify, especially with your background, the supply chain? What are the solutions there?
Looking at this from a governmental standpoint, it's supporting the right kind of behaviors and actions. That's a winding road when it comes to how the government can do that for whether it's individuals, whether those individuals are companies or coalitions or associations, those kind of things. But it is going to be probably the continuation, I think, of what we've started to see probably around the 2017-2018 period, which is a true national policy when it comes to critical minerals. And I know people would argue we already have something like that. We're already doing these very things, but just like the General said, these are very ineffective things that are holdovers from a time period, whether it's peace dividends or whether it's just national incompetence at early times. It's going to be a new solution. That's going to have probably a strong technology element to it. That's really going to help us leapfrog over decades of inaction and ignorance of what's there. So, the management of a supply chain and really a strategic stockpile, which would kind of buffer that, is going to have to be something we're going to have to rethink. We're going to have to do that in a way that's both economical in some ways, but also strategic. And that's probably going to alienate a government entity from doing that exclusively. I think there's room for some new ideas in that space.
Yeah, it's like almost expanding and diversifying, and that leads me to my question with you, Al. What would you say? Not only diversify the sources, but also invest in recycling, et cetera.
Absolutely. I think it would take all of those kinds of things when you look at the solutions that we have to come up with. First of all, we have to make sure that we create capability to be able to refine and process and hopefully source within the United States, or ensure that we move away from the reliance on one particular party that might not be as friendly to us in our time of need, whatever that time of need may be. So we need to be able to form stronger coalitions with our partner nations that are friendly and support us, and be able to work that, as well as be more collaborative across the industry in trying to find these solutions. But it will take all of the things that you mentioned, not only recycling and being able to do what they call urban mining, being able to go back and reuse the material that we've already dug out of the ground, right? It's been very costly to bring up, and so we need to be able to be more innovative in the way that we recycle and expand in set of commodities rather than those that we may be focusing on now. We need to make sure that we're using new technology that helps us bring it in, become more efficient with the use of minerals, as well as being able to be innovative in the ways that we manage our mineral sources that we do have. So it would take all of those things. It would take, diversifying the global supply chain, being able to have a strategic reserve of those minerals that would be able to get us through any kind of a disruption. As we see, disruptions can come in many forms, like we saw with COVID. So it doesn't necessarily need to be an act of war or some other global crisis that can contribute to that supply chain disruption. But in order to ensure the economic security, we need to be able to invest in all of those, whether it's sourcing, whether it's stockpiling or some sort of a reserve, innovation, recycling, all of those pieces would be required.
Yes, creating new avenues for investment and opportunities, I would say. Thank you for that, Al. So Peter, I'll ask you, what would you say are key investment opportunities in this space right now?
It's a great question. Typically when I look at that, I just try to track or try to figure out, or maybe predict, which is a bad word to use, maybe what the next interest item for a big player, like whether it's a defense technology or something that's on the horizon that's really interesting, can really change the dynamics of whether it's a battlefield or whether it's a kitchen appliance kind of thing. I mean, whatever's more of a disruptor, and then start doing some research into where that comes from and what are its components, and then find what those opportunities could be. But really trying to basically pull the string back from something that's emerging, back to all those things that you can understand, which is where this stuff actually comes from. It's really cool to have a new device. Actually understanding what's in that device, how it works, what's critical, what's replaceable, what can be duplicated in a different way, and then figure out what's unique in there, and then come after that.
And I like the fact that you say be a disruptor.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it seems like disruptions happen every day.
Every day. So, Al, from your perspective, what should businesses and investors be aware of when considering involvement?
Well, I think that it's a very fast-moving train, so to speak, when we look at what's going on in the world today, whether it's innovative technologies that are coming into place that are replacing what we're doing or that are actually enhancing what we're doing. But I think that at the end of the day, we need to look at, being a risk manager in my previous life, I think we need to look at what those risks are and being able to identify them so that then we can really overcome those. Being able to create a diverse portfolio is important, right, and significant, but being able to really measure the risks that we currently have in the system and being able then to counteract those with appropriate investments, capital investments, and being able to do that, whether it's in workforce development, whether it's in sourcing, and whether it's in diversifying the processing and refinement of those materials, being able to invest in those capabilities, bringing them back onshore or in friendshoring, I think are really significant. And then creating that strategic reserve, I think, is really significant as well. We have to find a way to implement that private-public partnership to be able to invest in setting a strategic mineral reserve that then can be used for emergencies and other factors as well.
Fantastic. Any final thoughts from you as far as takeaways?
Yeah, I think what you brought up with because it's come up a few times with the strategic, having owned a little bit of that while I was in the service, and obviously you dealing with that personally. The idea of rethinking, because it's more of a policy question, so it deals with so many different pieces of the U.S. federal government to change the approach that we take to a strategic stockpile. Right? Number one is understanding what should be in it, which currently is determined by folks that have little to no connection with emerging technologies, or even folks in this room. Definitely not in any way. I mean, the investment piece they understand because they'd love to sell it. One of their measures is just their buy-sell metrics, which is interesting, but not really maybe as appropriate for folks inside the government, because they're not really going for profit on that one. But really being able to tie that to things that are really being emerged. So I know I noticed in looking at some of that stuff, the missing players in that, whether it's even folks like NASA and other agencies that are at least regulatorily supporting the space industry and other industries, and then the ones that have indirect sort of circular effect on these defense technologies. Right. And so all those things, all those different players, maybe we just say really quickly as we take over the panel, how we would think to put together. You mentioned public-private partnership. I mean, I've thought about this in letting the market sort of manage these things, but to have at least a government concern in that. But what are some ideas right now?
Well, yeah, I would tend to think that when you look at the economic analysis that goes into determining what's in the national defense stockpile, it's a really, really high bar, because it's really designed to be able to support in the short term a rebuilding or the material losses that occur due to a potential threat that is created through a conflict that's created based on the threats that we know that are out there, and then being able to determine what material needs to be input into the system to allow us to rebuild or reconstitute that material, but only if that material is contested. So it's a very, very narrow space and a very, very high bar to really determine what the levels are there. So it's obviously inadequate to support the DoD needs, let alone the economic security of the nation.
And there's only contingency based. It's not really market based, right? So it doesn't really support the economy. It just supports the what if.
Right.
So what would you say investors need to keep, at the forefront of their minds when it comes to this, and how critical it really is?
It's a great question. Because anything when you're dealing with government, that just kind of throws a lot of logical thinking out the window. I think it's just keeping up with what those discussions are. I mean, we've seen a limited amount of granting out of the Defense Production Act, whatever section it might be.
DPA3.
DPA3 too. But maybe understanding how that process works, the both intent and arbitrary part of it at the same time. There's going to probably be, I suspect, over the next year and a half, some really in-depth conversations about this, both from a security perspective and also from it'll have to be a market perspective as we possibly go into a new administration that'll probably elevate the big power conversation again with us and China and with Russia, and how do we alternatively discuss those kind of threats or what we can do about them. So sanctions, as mentioned earlier, tariffs, all these different tools that the U.S. has or could use, and then what that effects could be.
Al, any final thoughts?
I think that from an investor's perspective, I think it's really important to be able to see what's on from the fundamental requirements that are needed, and looking at the market space for those, I think is really, really key. But also looking at how the innovative technologies that many universities, not that many programs left as far as mining programs, and I know that they're expanding, and we talk a lot with universities in the Southwest, but there are some innovative technologies that must be brought into play. And I think that there's some great opportunities to commercialize some of those technologies as well in the mining space. So I think that that's really significant. But at the end of the day, we need to really look towards opportunities to diversify the global supply chain to make sure it continues to feed the demand that we have from an economic perspective as well as a military perspective.
Fantastic. Really some important takeaways from today's discussion, gentlemen. Thank you so much. Al Rosende.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Peter O'Rourke, really appreciate your time and talking about the importance of critical minerals and its effect on global supply chains. And thank you for